Well, hello everybody. It is time for Sunday morning Power Bible Study. How's everybody doing? This is our third Sunday in Advent. And again, our first reading is from the book of Isaiah. And today, it's Isaiah chapter 61. If you are viewing this before worship, then you have not yet heard the readings. But if you're viewing it after worship on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, then you know, oh yeah, I remember hearing that. So it is chapter 61. And so chapter 61 is significant because it means that it comes in that portion of Isaiah from chapter 56 to 66, the last 11 chapters, I think it's 12 chapters actually, 56 to 66, where the last of the three Isaiahs is speaking. We got a little taste of this same Isaiah 2 weeks ago in the first Sunday of Advent. And now we get it again in the third Sunday. Now the second Sunday, remember we had a little bit from that Isaiah, the second Isaiah, right? Well, this is that third Isaiah. And that third Isaiah is the Isaiah that is preaching to people who are, the exile is basically over. And they are looking for the restoration of the temple. They're looking for the restoration of the city of Jerusalem. They're looking for the restoration of their power, their position in the world, their mission, if you will. When the Babylonians had exiled Judea in the 6th century, this writing comes, at the end of that, when that time was over and they were headed back. It was taken on as, it was interpreted by the prophets as, okay, this is your just desserts. This is what you get, because all of the promises in the book of Deuteronomy were very clear, and it said, if you obey, if you are, enjoy being in the Lord's will, if you relish in being God's people, guess what? You will actually reap the benefits of the land. But the gift of the land was very conditional, and the kings, the metaphor for the kings is the shepherds were unfaithful, and the people were led astray. The people ended up not keeping the covenant and not keeping the ways of the Lord. So, exile, losing the promised land. Well, post-exile is that time when, that time of punishment is over. It's like the consequences of our behavior are past us. It's time to look to the future, okay? There's always comes a time in a time of like where we feel like, okay, this is the consequences of my actions. Okay, I get it. And we should all, be at that point at some point or another of our actions. It's like, oh yeah, actions do have consequences. Well, there does come a time where, you know what, those consequences are over and it's time for a new future. It's not time for a new beginning. That's the kind of prophecy we get here. That's the reason why we use this for a time of Advent. The time of Advent is that time of waiting for the arrival, waiting for, and it's an expectation of something we really do need something good from God right about now. Definitely explains the way we are here in the year 2020, right? Here in December of 2020. So here, chapter 61, of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Now, I'm going to have to stop there, and this is still, the sentence isn't over. But what does this sound like? Or why is this sounding familiar? Why I believe this sounds familiar is because this is exactly what we hear Jesus say in the Gospel of Luke when he is at his home synagogue of Capernaum, and he is speaking for the first time, and he's like, it's his I don't know, inauguration, a speech. It's a speech of like launching his ministry, if you will, and he says the same thing. Remember, I'm going to look at it here. It's from Luke chapter 4. When he came to Nazareth, I'm sorry, I said Capernaum. It's Nazareth. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went up to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and as was his custom, he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written. Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's all he quotes. Basically, what he quotes there is Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1, and then he goes to Isaiah chapter 58, verse 6, and then he comes back to Isaiah 61, verse 2, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Do you remember what happened? This isn't a lesson about Luke chapter 4, but do you remember what happened at the end of Jesus' visit to Nazareth? They tried to push him off a cliff. Yeah. There was something in his speaking that they didn't like. The thing they didn't like, I believe, that really picked at him was that last thing that we read in his speech, and it was the first thing in chapter 2, or in Isaiah 61, verse 2, where he said, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What is that? In the book of Leviticus, there is a stipulation that at the end of every 50 years, the 50th year, so 7 times 7 is 49, at the end of, or into the 50th year, after those 49 years are done, is supposed to be a year of restoration, where all of the inherited lands go back to the original owner. You see, what happens over time is when there's inequity and inequality in a society, there are people who have to sell their rightful property off to other people to pay debts and stuff, right? And people end up going to debtor's prison. Remember, that's the thing. That's what prisons were all about back then. It wasn't that idea of you're guilty of a crime, you go to prison. No, it was for not being able to pay your debt. A lot of poor going on. Well, the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee, was the year that, hey, if you had to do that because if you had to sell off your family property, guess what? It's all forgiven. Everybody, it's like resetting the system. Like we're gonna just you know how when your computer isn't working and you just unplug it and then you plug it back in, kind of what we ought to do with the year 2020, right? unplug it, and then you plug it back in, and it gets a restart, and it's like everything reboots. That's what the year of the Lord's favor was supposed to accomplish. Now, here's the thing. They never did this. We have absolutely no evidence that Israel ever put into practice this thing of restoration at the end of the 49th year into the 50th year. So when we have the prophet okay, so that's why, just to finish my thing about Jesus, that's the reason why when Jesus said this, they got a little upset. They got a lot upset, because what he was basically saying was, hey, we need to do this. You've never done this? We need to do this. And that's the kind of radical message Jesus put out there, and that's the reason why they said, okay, this man must die. Well, Isaiah 61, in speaking to people who had been in exile, the idea of the year of the Lord's favor takes a different kind of a meaning, right? The kind of a meaning where it's like, oh, yeah, we get our land back. We lost it, but we get it back now, and everything will be restored. They needed hope. They needed to feel as though that they were liberated, and the day of vengeance of our God to comfort all who mourn. Yeah, vengeance. The event is like those who had taken our land are now they're getting their comeuppance, right? So let's continue with chapter 61 of Isaiah, verse 3. To provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. All of this is about comforting those and saying, hey, it's time to stop crying, and it's time to start celebrating, because God is going to do something good and big. That's one of the reasons why this is a very good scripture for the Advent season. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. You see, one of the misperceptions of Israel's chosenness, if you will, that this theme that they are the Lord's special people. One of the misunderstandings is that it was a calling of privilege. It was never a calling of privilege. It was always a calling of service. Yeah, there is something that is expected of you if you are going to be called the people of God. It's not just something to dangle in front of people's faces and to say, nah, we've got God and you don't. It's supposed to be a recognition of service. That expression, that the one to whom much is given, much is required. Yeah, well, there you go. Verse 4. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. What was the state of Jerusalem when they started retaking that city? It was destroyed. It had been leveled. The temple had been burned to the ground. Everything was destroyed. There was nothing but a heap there. Now, this is a promise of rebuilding, of especially the site where, Jerusalem's considered a holy city, right? And why was it holy? Because of the fact that that's where they experienced God in the temple. The idea of a repair of ruin being reestablished is also an example of a renewed faith, a renewed spirit. Now, when we in our passages in our lectionary that we actually hear in worship today, we do not have verses 5, 6, or 7. And part of that is because we're not exactly sure of the text. The text is a little bit, shall we say, shady. But there's some good stuff in it, but there's some stuff in it that we're not quite sure what it means. And but we're going to go ahead and read it. Verse 5, strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners shall till your land and dress your vines. But you shall be called priests of the Lord. You shall be named ministers of our God. You shall enjoy the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you shall glory. So, the reason why these verses aren't included in our lectionary is because not only are they a little bit suspect, their theology is a little bit like, wait a second here. This is saying, yeah, it is saying exactly what it sounds like, that the Israel is the one who is ministering and as a separated people, like there are people who aren't worthy of this, and we are worthy. That's the way it gets read. I think it should be read differently in terms of just a recognition that there are some who serve, and then there are those who are served. And it's not necessarily a racist thing. It's not necessarily a one-upmanship thing. I believe it's just a way of saying that, hey, there's a huge responsibility that goes with being God's people. And are there, will other people recognize that? Yes, if you indeed take on that role and not be haughty with it. They never did manage that. It always became a thing of separation. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And then verse 7 is the real weird one. It says, because their shame was double and dishonor was proclaimed as their lot, therefore they shall possess a double portion. Everlasting joy shall be theirs. Who's the there? Is it still talking? Because it was talking about people of the not of Israel. But yet it seems like it's now talking about Israel, but yet we don't really, it's kind of a confusing thing. In fact, the word there in verse 7, versus their shame, in the Hebrew, the word is actually your shame, right? Which is weird, because the rest of it, where we see the pronoun there, which is the referring to outside, occurs a couple more times. And it's like, so if we translate the first there as your, which is what it is in the Hebrew, and the other theirs as there, which it is in the Hebrew, it's like, because your shame was double and dishonor was proclaimed as their lot, therefore they shall possess a double portion. Everlasting joy shall be theirs. What? Who's they talking about? Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why when you ask the question, why are some verses not included in our Sunday morning lectionary text? Well, they're not included because they could bring up more questions than they answer, and so it's kind of a blessing to not have to deal with that on a Sunday morning. Although that's one of the things I do like to take on is discussing that, and that's the reason why we have a little extra Bible study for stuff like that. But I don't know exactly what the point here is. I think it's saying I do think that it's talking about the shame of Israel, okay, and I do believe it's talking about the joy of Israel and their lot. I don't think it's talking about the nations, because It's just, I think it's another way for the prophet to say, yeah, you have served your time, you have taken on the punishment, the circumstances of your actions, and because we all know bad actions have circumstances, and if we let it in, that, okay, you know what, I brought this on myself. If we can actually get to that point, instead of always dishing it off and saying, oh, it's because of them or because of that or because of, some sort of an external reason, if we can do that, then we will get the blessing that comes on the other side of it that much sooner. That's wisdom in living, folks. So, verses 8 through 11 are in our lectionary text of the morning. And in verses 8 and 9, we actually have it. One of the things we always want to keep in mind when we're reading text from the prophets, sometimes the prophet is talking, and sometimes the voice of God is talking. And it's important to get the difference between who is, and sometimes it's not necessarily either one. Maybe it's like a community response in using a first-person pronoun, even sometimes, or it could be somebody from the heavenly host. Okay, the hosts of heaven, and we had that in our chapter. I think it was 64 the other day. Well, here. In chapter 61, it is the Lord's voice in chapter 8. For I, the Lord, love justice. Oh, nice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. Justice was one of the reasons why, or I guess shall we say, was one of the things that was missing that allowed Israel to go downhill before the exile. The kings were accused of not actually attending to justice. They were self-aggrandizing. They were using their positions of power to gain wealth. They were not using it to give justice. And one of the emphases in all of the law, when we're talking about the law, the Torah, the instruction of like, oh, this is how you should be, one of the big emphases was on justice. And justice being something that was available to all because it was just fair, okay? But as we know, justice isn't blind. It's supposed to be, but it isn't. And it tends to favor the haves over the have-nots. That's the way it was back then. If you think about it, it's still the way it is today, okay? For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. The kings were accused of that, basically, of robbery. But yes, I will faithfully give them their recompense, and I will make an everlasting covenant with them. So the Lord is saying, yeah, my leaders in the past have not done what I wanted them to do. Well, I'm not going to let that doesn't mean I'm breaking covenant with everybody forever. I'm just saying, okay, we're going to press the restart button. And this idea of the everlasting covenant with them, and not necessarily specifically the Davidic king, means that the Lord is still committed to the people. And an everlasting covenant? Yes, an everlasting covenant, meaning something that doesn't end, meaning that the everlasting covenant of the Davidic kingship, notwithstanding, this is a promise for the people, okay? This is a very important promise on the part of God. Look at verse 9. This is also coming from the mouth of the Lord. Their descendants shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them shall acknowledge that they are a people whom the Lord has blessed. This is another indication of how the people are called not to privilege, but to service. Their descendants shall be known among the nations, and their offspring among the people. All who see them shall acknowledge that they are a people blessed, whom the Lord has blessed. So it isn't in a way of a haughty way, of a nanny, we've got God and you don't. It is simply the fact that the service to God is not going to be seen as, oh, those people are really holy. No, the idea is, oh, look at the kind of justice, look at the kind of system of of fairness to everyone. That's like, wow, nobody can be like that. That's really hard for human beings to do. Yeah, it is. Well, that's the kind of representatives Israel were supposed to be in the world, so other people could actually recognize the fact that, oh, God is with them simply because of how advanced and how progressive they were in their justice. Verse 10. I will. Okay, now we are so the Lord is no longer speaking. We are now hearing, it's like the voice of the prophet, or it's the voice of the community speaking using the one person, the first person pronoun. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. All of this stuff is speaking of that idea of like our acceptability to God has nothing to do with who we are. It has everything to do with who God is. God is the one that lays that garment on us. It's a way of wrapping us. Like it's like, you know, you've seen those buses and train cars, light rail and such, and some people actually do it on their vehicles where they get them wrapped in an advertising message, and it's basically stuck to it. And it's like permanent, almost like paint, right, on the outside. That's the kind of like the idea here is like that's the kind of cloak we wear. It's something that's just a part of who we are now, but it's something God has given us. And it's not something we've earned. We can't earn it. It's impossible to earn it. It only comes as a free gift of God. That's the robe of righteousness. It's not the robe of self-righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with a garland, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. The idea is that it makes us look celebratory, and not a people in ashes, not a people singing a dirge, not a people being negative. It's a positive exuberance. It's a pleasantness. This is one of the reasons why people can see, and when they look and say, "Oh wow, they're a happy people in serving God, and not a sad and disappointed and dispersed and dirgic kind of people." Verse 11, last verse. For as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations. Again, the emphasis is on that whatever glory of God, whatever goodness we show, whatever it is that comes up out and that's displayed to the world, we can never take pride in it and saying, look what I did. Look what I did. No, it's what God did. God's the one who planted it. God is the one who caused it to, what is sown to spring up. So the Lord will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations. So, and the nations will see this. The idea is that our glory of the Lord, our reflecting the Lord in the way we are being, will be so attractive to those outside that they will get it and like, we want some of that. We want what they're having. That's the idea of service. So this is our message of Advent 3. And it's what we have to look forward to. When our Messiah comes, when our salvation comes, we can rest assured that it's not our righteousness, it's not our goodness. We've done nothing to deserve it. It's a free gift of God that comes to us. And we, with joy then, receive that and allow ourselves to say, oh, thank you, God, for that gift, and being gracious for it, knowing that we haven't deserved it. It doesn't appeal to our ego. It should appeal, though, to our best selves. And that's what we're trying to rebirth in this time of Advent and our time of waiting for that arrival. So that is our Bible study, our Sunday morning Power Bible study today. I hope if you did watch this before the service, enjoy the service. And if you haven't, then we'll see you on Wednesday. Wednesday we are doing a walkthrough of the entire Gospel of Mark. And I think we're in chapters like 7, 8, 9 this week, this coming Wednesday. Anyway, enjoy your Sunday. Blessings.